the more I've looked into the Trinity, the more I've appreciated that it doesn't make sense, but once you believe in it, it makes sense of everything else. So I'm not saying one thing is crazy, so let's pivot anywhere and everywhere and believe in anything that's crazy. I'm just saying everyone, whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, or an atheist, believes something like the Trinity occurred at the origins of the universe. Is the Trinity a contradiction? I don't know. Maybe I'll get to heaven when I die and God will be like, bro, you're an idiot. This is how it makes sense. And I'll be like, oh, I should have seen that.
Greetings from Serbia. My name is Nemanja Jurišić and welcome to another NT podcast. Today we have honor of hosting remarkable guest Dr. J.D. Lyonhart, an assistant professor of theology and philosophy at Lincoln Christian University and a fellow at the prestigious Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism. Dr. Lyonhart, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. So glad to be here.
By the way, such an epic last name. I really like it. So,
Oh, thanks. I made it myself. My last name was Lyon and my wife's last name was Hart. So when we got married, we legally combined it because we felt like God would punish us if we didn't take that opportunity. So
awesome. I like, by the way, that guy from history, Richard, I believe, Lionheart. I forgot from history.
yeah,
Yeah, he's
yeah, I know. Not everyone loves him because of the Crusades, but yeah, he's got a
yeah, but
cool
I
name.
don't. Yeah, I don't remember him from history, but rather from games. So yeah, yeah.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
okay. Well, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers. Tell us about your academic background, your area of study, what you do, and anything else you would like to share with us.
Yeah, sure. I guess for background, I was a minister for 5 years in Vancouver, Canada, at a Chinese Mennonite church, which those exist. So yeah. And then I was doing my master's at that time in Christianity and culture at Regent College. And so my interests have always been not just Christian theology, but Christian theology and the broader world that it interacts with, the broader cultural milieu, science, philosophy, politics, those types of conversations. And I really loved doing ministry, really loved my church community there. I still think about them all the time. But we felt called to do more academic stuff. So I went and did my PhD at the University of Cambridge. Uh, and then I became an assistant professor of theology and philosophy at LCU. And I actually just started a new job this month. I'm associate professor of Christianity and philosophy at the University of Jamestown, also in the US. So that's kind of where I am now, and loving teaching, really enjoying writing as well. I like to publish and stuff, and we'll probably get into some of that in some of my answers. But my work is at the intersection of Christianity and philosophy, and I consider myself an interdisciplinary theologian and philosopher. So I really don't have a specialization I stick to. I'm constantly pivoting to new areas. My first book was on the Trinity and free will and the origins of the universe. My second book was on God's relationship to space and time. My next book's just like an introductory level, like Tim Keller, The Reason for God, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity type book. I kind of just go wherever I feel like going at any particular time. And yeah. So in the podcast I host, the Spiritually Incorrect podcast, we we do some in-depth theology stuff, but we kind of just go wherever our interests are. We had a guy from NASA on to talk about aliens and how that would impact faith. We had a Satanist on a few weeks ago. We've had ex-witches on. We've had an exorcist on. We had Rupert Sheldrake, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, the Cambridge biologist, to talk about whether telepathy is real. So I like doing any sort of subject that's interdisciplinary, that's Christianity and some other thing. And yeah, so that's
And
me.
that's awesome. I saw it. Yeah, you have on channel creationists, evolutionists. You really don't care, just want to speak on various topics. So great.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll have it pretty much anybody. So
Yeah. All right. Today's topic is about arguments for atheism, but we won't cover two arguments, which are big arguments and deserve maybe whole show about that. Uh, First is evidentiary problem of evil, and second, divine hiddenness. But we will cover other less arguments, weaker, let's say. So, yeah, can I just quickly ask you about your opinion? Why do you believe in God? That's a common question, and yeah.
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, I believe in God because I have an experience of God. And that was why I originally became a Christian and started taking my faith seriously at 17. I had a sense that God loved me, that I was a sinner and needed forgiveness, and I felt like I had this close connection with Jesus, and that's gotten stronger and stronger. And yeah, so an experiential sense of God's presence, a sense that when I'm reading the Bible and encountering Jesus, this is someone unlike anyone else in history. And I think people want stronger arguments than that, but I think once you actually get into the nitty-gritty of philosophy, you realize that actually at the end of the day, those are about as strong a things as you're going to get for anything, including like whether the universe exists, whether matter in the external world is real. Like a lot of arguments end up just coming back to, I have this sense that this is the way things are. And that's very much true for me. Beyond that, though, I would say I'm deeply convinced of the moral or axiological argument, this sense that um, my encounter with beauty, aesthetics, and morality and things having meaning is only an objective, real encounter if those are grounded in one who is beauty and goodness itself. Um, and so I no longer just experience God in a sense of, oh, there's a guy who appears to me in the clouds. It's very much anytime I have an encounter with beauty or goodness, I just feel close to God. And those things to me are as real as the material universe itself. And I think just empirically, phenomenologically, in people's daily experiences, if they were honest with themselves, the fact that some things are meaningful and moral and beautiful is as deniable, is as obvious as the fact that there's like a wall right here. And in fact, in some cases, I think those moral and aesthetic intuitions are more convincing and undeniable than our belief in the physical world. I mean, the example I always use is when I was at a concentration camp visiting in Dachau, and I stood over this field where, there was all these graves underneath. And I just had this sense like, at first, my sense was, how could God allow this to happen? The problem of suffering. But then it transitioned to, well, unless God exists, there's no moral objective standard by which this is wrong. And so my sense that this is wrong, absolutely, eternally, objectively, is actually presupposing that God exists. And I think that intuition that people have, that something like the Holocaust is objectively wrong, is as powerful an intuition as my intuition that the world exists. Like, that's very strong. And so I'm very convinced of that in my daily life. I just live in a world that assumes God in almost every facet of it, in every encounter I have. So I'd find that quite persuasive. It sounds like you're wanting to focus on the arguments for the existence of God a bit. So I guess that was the moral argument would be the one I find the strongest in that sense. So
Well, many will argue that moral argument is bad or weakest of all arguments, but yeah, I noticed that many philosophers think differently. So that's some change, I believe.
yeah. I mean, I think some people think it's weaker because it has to do with emotions and feelings and those types of things. Um, I guess I don't dismiss those aspects of myself. And if you look at like philosophy in the 20th century, someone like Heidegger he takes emotions seriously. he says these are major aspects of who we are. So what are they telling us about reality? Um, and if you want to say that, my moral and aesthetic intuitions are just projections of my subjective mind upon the world, well, that same argument applies to reason. That's why Thomas Kuhn was able to say that science is a projection of human reason onto the world. And like, and that's the whole postmodern critique. There's no way to know if anything we're saying is real beyond a projection of ourselves onto the world. And the same critique of emotions and morality and aesthetics gets turned onto reason in the last 50 years. And reason and science don't have any better answer to it than anyone else does. So I'm not sure why I would trust, say, the cosmological argument over the moral argument, unless I was just favoring one aspect of human mind and saying that aspect wasn't a projection of myself onto reality. No, that's really true. Well, how do you know which part of you is a projection and which part of you isn't? Like, there's no way to answer that. And science gets us beyond the biases and projections of the individual, because one scientist can check another scientist somewhere else. But it doesn't get us beyond the projections and biases of the species. Because if humans do not see the world accurately, if our rational categories and faculties don't correspond to reality, there's no way you're going to know that, because the whole species is in on the joke. Like, there's no way around it. I mean, bats are able to process data that humans don't even experience. What if reality is just occurring in just a different wavelength or dimension from ourselves, and science just doesn't even come close to getting at what's real? There's no way around that. So if my emotions and aesthetics and moral intuitions are a projection, then maybe, let's go the Descartes route and say that matter is just a projection and there's no way to really know any of it's real. And if you're looking at things like quantum physics and some of the theories coming out of physics today, the most likely conclusion might be that matter in the way that we think of it doesn't exist. So like, what's real and what isn't? It's really all up for grabs. And some people want to make it simpler than that, but it isn't. It isn't at all. So my sense is that the world has meaning. And I think God is the one who grounds that. If someone doesn't have that sense, I can't argue with them. I can just be like, well, sorry, I think you probably did have that sense when you were younger, but you've been overeducated to the point where you don't think you do anymore. But yeah.
All right. When you say experience, you don't talk about some visions or something supernatural, but rather something deep, feeling about God's presence, tranquility, peace, love. Do you think of that or something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it in those sort of categories. When I experience goodness, it draws me up towards the one who is goodness itself. And so I'm not encountering God coming down and going, Jonathan, I have a plan for you. I'd like you to go over here and talk to this person. They need to be saved. That's not how I'm experiencing God. It's much more in the sense of, hey, what has this divine artist made? And looking at the artwork of creation, looking into my children's eyes, and uh, going out into the backyard with the sun glimmering down, and it's rained a bunch, and so there's a little stream that's collected at the bottom of the hill in our backyard. And like all of that, it's just like I just have an encounter with beauty that draws me up to the one who is beauty itself. And uh, for me, I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago. I would have been much more rationalistic 10 years ago. But for me today, uh, especially after having kids, my my experience of the one who is goodness and beauty itself is just everywhere, and I can't deny it. I wouldn't even know how to function in the universe without it. The I would this is that a universe where God doesn't exist just isn't in my experiential framework anymore. So,
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lyonhart. And we can begin with arguments for atheism now. What about the logical problem of Trinity? How you wrestle with this question? This is your main topic because you have a book about that monotheism, so you can say something about
Yeah.
that.
Oh yeah, I've got it right here. Monotheism, yay! Self-promotion. So yeah, basically the argument in monotheism, which is this. Sorry. Basically, in my book, I say, well, looking at the Trinity, how does this make sense? How is God one and three, three and one? How is there this father figure who's sort of transcendent, absolute, the God of classical theism who's up in the clouds, and yet somehow he also comes down and incarnates in time and space as the Son, who grows up like a baby, who whines, poops, has to learn how to walk, and eventually gets crucified. How is God one and three? How is he up there, but also down here? And all of the attempts that theologians and philosophers have made to make sense of that. I mean, I don't want to say I've read all of it because I haven't, but I've read enough of it to say I don't think any of it makes logical sense. I think it inevitably stretches the bounds of finite human thought. I've never been able to make sense of it. But interestingly, after my initial encounter with the Trinity and thinking it was silly when I was younger, because when you go to church when you're young and in Sunday school, someone's trying to sell you on the Trinity and you're like, you're crazy, man. What are you smoking? And I kind of just thought, well, the Trinity doesn't make sense, so I'm not going to believe in it. And I just kind of continued on my way. But then I started studying cosmology and specifically the origins of the universe. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized, well, that doesn't really make sense either. No one's really been able to explain how the universe could come to be. And the answers given to it for it are just horribly bad. No one's gotten even slightly closer to it. It's just, and the more I looked at the problem of how the universe began to exist, the more I realized, hey, this actually sounds a lot like the same philosophical conceptual problem I was facing when I looked at the Trinity. These are actually quite similar problems, and they're not just similar, they're actually the same exact enigma, just in different language. One is in the language of theology, the other in the language of cosmology. And I kind of got to this point where I was like, wait a second, is this not two separate problems, but one problem being articulated in two different ways? No one can explain the Trinity for the exact same reasons no one can explain the origins of the universe. It's the same conceptual thing that people can't get past. And then I realized, well, if the problem of the Trinity is the same problem of the origins of the universe, then does that mean that the Trinity makes as much sense to believe in as our own existence? Um, and so, because if the Trinity doesn't make sense, well, I don't believe in it. But if the universe coming into existence doesn't make sense, well, you can't just not believe in that because I'm here, right? Like I exist. The universe exists. So you can't just dismiss that. So I have to accept that something like the universe coming to exist, even though it's irrational and can't be made sense of, must have happened. And if something like that can happen, and it's the same issue as the Trinity, then perhaps the Trinity can't be denied any more than I could deny my own existence, because it makes as much sense as my own existence. So that's the argument of the book in monotheism. And I think it's unique to me. It's anytime a theologian says that they've come up with something new, you want to be very skeptical of that. And if someone's talked about this before, then great, we can talk about it. But I think I am wording it at least in a new way. And so that's the argument. Of course, the follow-up question is, but how is the Trinity the same problem as the origins of the universe? And we can get into that. But the basic frame of the argument is the one that I just presented.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And can you continue with other examples? I believe you mentioned free will because, yeah, we have also contradiction in that specific
Yeah.
thing. So, yeah.
So my answers won't help unless I go deeper into what the problem is. But basically, I then in the book pivot to taking the exact same tact with free will as I took with the Trinity. Well, free will doesn't make sense, but when you look at the origins of the universe, it also doesn't make sense. And actually, the problem of free will is identical to the problem of the Trinity and the problem of the origins of the universe. And so it makes as much sense to believe in free will as your own existence. So I take that tact in the book with a lot of different things. because I think the Trinity is essential for understanding of pretty much everything. So once you've made it rational to believe in the Trinity, or at least as rational as our own existence, you can then pivot and show, well, that suddenly makes sense of everything else as well. Um, and to explain how that works, I'd have to get more in depth into the argument itself, but that's the basic idea. Uh, so.
Can we say it is similarly like photons because it is also particle and wave? So is it maybe similar?
Yeah, no, I think there's a similarity there that at kind of the fundamental bedrock of reality, you're having these at least these paradoxes. I don't know if they ultimately are contradictions, but they at least seem that way. So maybe we'll just use the language of paradox. But being itself at a fundamental level isn't fitting into our logical categories, at least not right now. So.
All right. Do you have maybe argument why analogies don't work? Because some people think that we can say Trinity is like, for example, William Craig would say, like a dog with three heads or something. Can you comment that?
Yeah, so I think the thing with analogies is they're always like and dislike the thing that they're supposed to be talking about. So a perfect analogy isn't perfect because if it was one to one the same in every respect, then you wouldn't be talking about something that was analogous. You'd just be talking about the same thing. Because something that was exactly analogous to something else in every single detail would just be that thing. Like you can so analogies always combining likeness and dislikeness in order to make the analogy. And so do I think a three-leaf clover is analogous to the Trinity? A little bit. Yeah. Does it get you all the way there to the Trinity? No, of course not. But imagery, arts, these types of these things aren't necessarily meant to be a one-to-one literal rendering. They're meant to help the mind wrap itself in baby steps around something that is beyond itself, and which finite language can't ever quite grasp. So like Cerberus the free-headed dog. Is that a perfect parallel to the Trinity? No. Did it help me when I was a freshman to sort of build some baby steps closer to the Trinity? Yeah, it did. Um, and obviously with saying that the origins of the universe is like the Trinity, you could see that as an analogy. I actually wouldn't say it's an analogy because I don't think they're two similar problems. At the end of the book, you end up realizing I think they're the same problem because it's not the Trinity and oh, the origins of the universe. No, for the Christian, it was always the Trinitarian God who created the universe. So these were never two questions, they were always one question. So it's not that the origins of the universe is analogous to the Trinity, it's that the Trinitarian God forged the universe in it through its Trinitarianness. So I wouldn't actually use analogy in that context, but that would be kind of similar to that. And I definitely think we have to use analogies to explain things. And I'm okay with that. And I get a bit annoyed with people who are like, oh, that's modalism, Patrick. It's like, get over yourself. People need baby steps to get somewhere. Yes, some analogies are better or worse than others, but just because they're not perfect doesn't mean they're not useful.
All right, thank you. And why not to believe in, you mentioned modalism, partialism, tritheism. It seems like we don't have contradiction, so that's better solution. Why don't you accept that view?
So I want to be as rational as I possibly can, but I don't want to be more rational than reality itself. And I think some people are taking their cues for how rational the world should be based on what makes sense to their minds instead of actually going outside and like looking at reality. And reality is just constantly bursting everything my finite mind thinks or expects it's going to be. I think the most rational thing is that the universe, if it is beyond me and not just a projection of me and my thinking, of course it'll be beyond my reason. If it wasn't, I would suspect it was a projection of myself and my reason. And so I think the most rational thing is to admit that there's something beyond your reason. I think reason points beyond itself. And I think ultimately God is the Logos, but it's also one Trinitarian member who's the Logos. And so it's, and so I argued this recently on Twitter with Ryan Hacker. Um, is everything rational? Well, I think you could say yes, in the sense that the Father is one with the Logos, the Son, and yet the Father is not the Son, such that there is an aspect of ontology that isn't identical with Logos, with speakability, with reasonability. And so I would say all things are rational, but also not rational, in the same way that the Father is one with the Son, but isn't identical with the Son. All things can be articulated using reason and human language, but that doesn't mean all things totally are reducible to reason and human language, any more than the fact that we can know the Father through the Son reduces the Father to the Son. So.
Okay, and just to ask you a simple question, am I too biased if I say something like this? Trinity's original idea, and people naturally wouldn't or couldn't invent idea of Trinity. It is not very human. So is it too biased for? Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thought that truth makes enough sense that it's like, oh yeah, that's not ridiculous, but is odd enough that you wouldn't have guessed it. Truth is stranger than fiction, right? Um, and so C.S. Lewis talks a bit about the flavor of truth, or the smell, or the width of truth, the taste of truth. This sense sometimes you have with things that, like, this is weird, but in a way that's just the right amount of weirdness. Any weirder, and I couldn't believe it. Any less weird, and I don't know if I would believe it either, because it would seem too contrived. And I think there's a sweet spot there. And I think it's a very subjective sweet spot. But I think we all have that sense sometimes. So, and I think the Trinity, um, the more I've looked into the Trinity, the more I've appreciated that it doesn't make sense. But once you believe in it, it makes sense of everything else. Um, and and I think it's the mystery at the heart of existence, in light of which everything else suddenly becomes less mysterious. It's it's once you don't I don't understand the Trinity, but once I accept it, I can then understand everything else in light of it. And I think it makes sense, and it doesn't make sense in that way. It makes sense of everything else while not itself making sense. And that's kind of the sweet spot, right? Like I don't know if anyone would have come up with it, but now that we have it, it makes a lot of sense of a lot of things. And so that's the tension. So.
Oh, good answer. Thank you. And is there some beauty in idea of three? Why not two or four? Is there something special in the number of three? What do you say?
Yeah, so I have an argument in my book Monotheism where I explain why it has to be three. That argument will take like 20 minutes to make. I'm happy to make it, but it seems like you'd rather, so I, more generically, if I was just appealing to what other people have said, one on its own, would be just sort of, I don't know if God was one, I don't know if love would make sense in that universe, because that would mean that at the heart of all existence, at the heart of ontology and being itself, is absolute oneness. It's not relationship. It's not community. It's not the dance of friendship or sexuality. It's not love. It's not romance. It's not passionate throes. It's just a lonely, isolated individual on their own. And so love would be a later invention, sort of a perversion of the original oneness. And community and connection. All of these things would be later inventions. I don't want to say social constructs, but constructs, not eternally, objectively absolute goods in the sort of moral argument kind of way, but inventions. Um, and I'd also say under oneness, if it's just one entity, I think all diversity, difference, and otherness would then also be a perversion of that original oneness and unity. And so all diversity in culture. Like those are bad things. What you want is homogeneity and oneness because that reflects the one at the heart of existence, right? And so I think if there's just one, then there's a lot of implications that flow out of that because your ontology and your theology impacts your ethics, right? So if there's two, I think then you get love, then you get relationship, then you get intimacy. I don't know if you get community. You get perhaps uh, the intensity of one-on-one romantic love if there's two, but the three is what gets you community, what gets you a broader thing in your ontology and then your world picture. Um, I'd also say with two, I don't know if this is inescapable. I think there's ways to avoid this, but it's very easy to end up with a dualistic kind of God. And you sort of have this sort of Star Wars universe where there's good and evil. And for a lot of people, that makes sense. But if good and evil are both equally grounded in ontology and in the nature of God, then this is what could be called an ontology of violence. Good will never overcome in the end. We're just doomed to cyclically repeat violence and the conflict between good and evil forever, because in the very bedrock and foundations of existence, those two are in struggle, and one is not deeper or more foundational than the other. If it was, then that would just be one God, and the other would be sort of a demi lower level thing. But the two in conflict, I don't know if that has to lead to that sort of Manichaean picture, but I think that it often does. Um, and there's some tension there. And there's also this question of, if there's two, what is the unity between them, right? What unifies the separate individuals? And if there's a unity there, then you've brought in a third element already to say that there's something underlying them that connects them both. And I think in some ways, that could be seen as where Trinitarianism is inevitable, because one distinct entity, another distinct entity that have no overlap. And so they can have nothing to do with each other, right? But if there is overlap, then you have this thing in and of itself, this thing in and of itself, and then this third thing where they meet, where they're united, where they're connected. And that third thing cannot just be reducible to the other two, or else they wouldn't actually be united. They would just be separate individuals. So I think threeness makes a lot of sense, but I could see some potential retorts to that as well. I think threeness allows you to have the diversity, difference, otherness, movement of two without some of those problems. And I think the beauty of the Trinity is, instead of saying it's just one or it's three, we say it's both. Because you want oneness. You need oneness for unity underlying the nature of existence, right? Like, we want to be united. We want there to be one absolute kind of, we want there to be one standard for morality. We don't want diversity to apply to all things in existence, such that the serial killer isn't wrong. He's just another perspective in the diverse array of perspectives. So we want unity, underlying oneness, but we also want diversity in there. And I think the beauty of the Trinity is that it doesn't force you to pick oneness or threeness. It says you can have both of those: unity in diversity, oneness amongst manyness, relationship and individuality at the same time. It's not the community trumping the individual, which it would be if it was oneness over threeness, nor is it the individual that trumps the community, which it would be if you had threeness more primary than oneness. Rather, it's both. God is three and one, and neither of those is more fundamental than the other, and it doesn't make sense, but once you believe in it, it then makes sense of everything else. It makes sense of why we strive for the courage to be ourselves, but also strive to be in community with others at the same time. And that's a tension that we're all stuck in. And if you go too far one way, you lose something from the other. Because we're made in the image of a Trinitarian God who's both one and three, communal and individual. So yeah, anyways.
Yeah, incredible explanation. Thank you so much. And when you consider universe as a scholar, philosopher, do you see some connections between Trinity and the three dimensions? Water has three components: sun, light, hate. You know, do you
Yeah.
see something like reflects Trinity, his nature, or no? Is it too much?
On a pedagogical level, I think reality is constantly reminding us that things can also somehow be wedded to other things. And um, unity is always constantly in the midst of diversity. And things that seem like they're one can actually be two or three things. And so I think all things point back to the underlying unity and diversity that is ultimately grounded in the Trinity. But does that mean I think God pointed his finger and said, "Three-leaf clover, you shall be my sign to the Irish that I am Trinity, and all the other nations won't get it"? No, I don't think it was specially designated for that by God. I think all things bear the mark of unity in diversity that points back to the unified one and the diversified three. Um, Whether that's, hey, how does the mind, body, and soul relate? Well, those are united as one, but they're also separate as three. That's as far as we're ever going to get. I don't think neuroscience or philosophers of consciousness are going to do any better than that. I don't even know how they theoretically could. It's a mystery. So yeah, anyways, that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, that's better
And those
thinking.
those analogies can be helpful. Those analogies can be
Yeah.
helpful, even if they're incomplete.
All right. And what about mysteries? Some people would say that's running from contradictions, obviously. Where is the symmetry breaker? Because we can go in skeptical theism, we can say for everything that it's a mystery. And do you consider this problem of Trinity, logical problem, as a squared circle or not?
I could say a few things. In my book, Monotheism, available on Amazon. um, in the book, I do argue that I don't say that the Trinity is a contradiction, nor do I say the origins of the universe are a contradiction. Rather, I say that you can't disbelieve in them for currently seeming like a contradiction. So, is the Trinity a contradiction? I don't know. Maybe I'll get to heaven when I die and God will be like, "Bro, you're an idiot. This is how it makes sense." And I'll be like, "Oh, I should have seen that." Um, and same thing with the origin of the universe. Maybe that's the case. All I am saying is, well, currently, to my finite fallen mind, this seems like a contradiction. However, when you look at the origin of the universe, it also seems like a contradiction. And I don't think those are two separate contradictions. Like I said before, I think the Trinitarian God created the universe. So it's not two contradictions, it's one. And so for me, the Trinity then makes as much sense as our own existence. Um, and that doesn't mean the Trinity ultimately doesn't make sense. It just means you shouldn't disbelieve in the Trinity for not currently seeming like it makes sense. And those are very different things. I'm not claiming contradictions exist or that the Trinity is a contradiction. I'm claiming that just because things currently seem like contradictions doesn't mean you should disbelieve in them. Currently, general relativity and quantum mechanics seem like a contradiction. Do I think those actually are a contradiction? Well, maybe 50 to 100 years from now, we'll have figured out how it works. Great. But should we disbelieve in general relativity and quantum physics because currently, because they seem to be in contradiction? No. The evidence for both of those things are really good. I'm not going to disbelieve in them, even though they currently seem like a contradiction. And perhaps, hopefully, will eventually show that they aren't one. And I'm hopeful that perhaps the Trinity isn't either. With that said, though, that general methodology I just used, some have been worried that it will explode. That once you allow one little bit of mystery into your worldview, well, then you can pivot from one mystery to all other mysteries, right? You're saying the origins of the universe doesn't make sense and the Trinity doesn't make sense either. So let's believe in that because we believe in the universe. Um, and then someone comes along and says, well, quantum physics doesn't make sense, and poltergeists don't make sense. So I'm going to believe in poltergeists because quantum physics is weird too. So why not? And it could just sort of explode, and anyone can believe in anything, right? They can say there's one thing and that's absurd, then they pivot to all these other things. But that's one of the reasons I'm very careful to say that the Trinity is not another absurd thing in addition to the origins of the universe. I'm not pointing to the universe and saying that doesn't make sense. And oh, hey, the Trinity doesn't make sense. So let's just believe in everything that doesn't make sense. Rather, I'm saying the origins of the universe are the same problem as the Trinity. It's not one problem that I'm pivoting to another and saying, well, if this doesn't make sense, then why not believe anything? Rather, I'm saying the problem of the Trinity is the problem of the origins of the universe because the Trinitarian God created the universe. And so if you solve one, you've inherently solved the other. So I'm not saying one thing is crazy, so let's pivot anywhere and everywhere and believe in anything that's crazy. I'm just saying everyone, whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, or an atheist, believes something like the Trinity occurred at the origins of the universe. And so if you're going to believe that when it comes to the origins of the universe, then, you're already saying something kind of like the Trinity. So even if you're just putting it into a secular language, I think cosmology looks a lot like theology when you really get into it. And so I'm not pivoting from one crazy thing to another. I'm just saying we all believe this one crazy thing, whether you're a Christian or not. And I actually think that one crazy thing looks a lot like the Trinity. So I'm not adding an additional crazy thing on top of the crazy thing everyone already believes. I'm just saying that crazy thing has been Trinitarian all along. And that's really important because I don't think you can pivot from one crazy thing to as many crazy things as you want and let's believe in fairies. I don't think that. I'm just saying I've tried as hard as I can to be as rational about everything as I possibly can, and I can't make sense of this one thing. And this one thing happens to be identical to the Trinity. So if I believe I exist, then maybe the Trinity's real too, even though I don't understand it. And that's a very different thing from just throwing logic out altogether. And notice that that was a very rational argument for the irrational. Um, I'm I'm trying to say that the Trinity makes as much rational sense as our own existence. I don't think the Trinity needs to make more sense than our own existence. If I make the Trinity as rational to believe in as reality itself, that's good enough for me. If you want to make it more rational than your own existence, go right ahead. But I don't think this is just fideism, where I'm saying, well, no one can know anything, so just believe. No, I'm. This is a very rational argument to get to something being beyond reason, and that's different from just throwing up your hands and saying it's all a mystery. Um, I'm arguing the Trinity makes as much sense as reality, which I think is actually quite a rational thing to say.
Awesome. Okay, this is hard for me because I don't want to stop talking about this topic. That's your expertise, so I really enjoy and learn much. So last, I promise, and we go tackle next arguments, but little, yeah, less than this one. Yeah. So can we say that God's mathematics is just simply different than ours? For example, Jesus say first will be last. That's not usual our thinking or something like that. So, and also I wonder what your colleagues say about your work, about that explanations, and what is reaction in academia about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, if you want to just say God's mathematics are different from ours, I think that's a fun way to put it. If God is infinite, we're finite. And I think some people see that as an appeal to mystery. I think that's inescapably the nature of self and other. If the other is not reducible to the self, then there's going to be parts of it that go beyond me and my understanding. My wife is other from me, and I know a lot about her, but I'll never fully exhaust or understand everything about her, and she'll continue to surprise me forever and ever. And if God is truly other, there will be things about him that continue to surprise and shock and be things that I wouldn't have thought would be true about him. Whether that's at the first shall be last ethical servant level or at a more philosophical ontological level. I think that's inherent to the very language of self and other. And I don't think it's something that's irrational. I think it's what we, using our reason, should have logically expected all along. That the other will always be other from us in some way. And yet in Christ has made itself known. So that's the enigma of it. It's so other that it can be other and like us at the same time, which just shows how paradoxically other it is that it can do that. As for my colleagues, um, I'm it depends who you talk to. Theologians, the language of the Trinity has been really complicated and nuanced, and the minutia of it has been exhaustively gone over and over again for thousands of years. And trying to say something new about the Trinity tends to just be met with a, you idiots, who do you think you are? Especially when you're doing it in language that isn't the traditional language. Like, I'm not using a lot of the traditional formulas and things like that. Not because I don't believe in those things. I think we've hit a dead end with this to some extent. And I'm really frustrated with a lot of the scholars who do this area. I just think it's, uh, yeah. So a lot of theologians don't, a lot of people who focus on the Trinity don't really like what I'm doing because I'm not fitting into that system terribly well. And, usually I would say I would hold the system and tradition in quite high regard. I think we should take seriously church councils and tradition and traditional language and stuff like that. But I've been doing that for a long time with the Trinity, and I've just started to bang my head against the wall and just be like, okay, I want to be faithful to this, but you guys just, this is really boring. You're not saying anything interesting. We're just arguing over the minutia of terms here. And so I don't fit in great with that crowd. But I also don't really want to. I want to write stuff that's theologically creative and new, but which the common person in the church can understand if they're willing to put in some effort. And I don't think that's just, popular level. That's the easy stuff. I think that's harder to do than what a lot of theologians do. And I also think that tethers you to reality. I think if you can't explain something to a freshman at college, you don't understand it yourself. Um, and I think that's where a lot of theologians, especially on Trinitarian theologians, they can't explain it to anyone but themselves. And I'm not sure they have a clue what they're talking about anymore. So, yeah, anyways, the point is, I don't do great with other people in this field. But I do find that people who aren't specialized in this field connect with it really well. And there's something's being said there that they find interesting and aren't hearing somewhere else. So,
Amazing. All right, let's move on to next argument. I promise I will not ask boring questions like this about first question. The logical problem of evil. What can you say about that? Does that prove that God cannot exist?
yeah, I mean, I know people talk about the empirical versus logical. I don't think it logically proves he can't exist. I think there's lots of possible answers, even if they're not great. The sheer fact they're possible makes it not a logically, axiomatic case. Um, so yeah, I don't think we can, I don't think anyone can say, therefore God does not exist in the way that a logical argument would try to make it. I think it does need to get more empirical and subjective than that. So,
Yeah, but people will say that we again go to skeptical atheism because we can say, well, there might be a reason why God allows evil. So we can say also, well, maybe God is evil. Yeah, we cannot rule that out. So yeah, we can be skeptical on anything. So how you answer on that?
yeah, I think that's one of those moves that it's kind of like, well, if that's what your experience of reality is, I'm not entirely sure how I could disprove that for you. All I can say is that my moral experience of reality isn't that, and neither is my spiritual experience of reality. Um, but that's one of those types of things where there's, maybe the idea of an evil God and Schopenhauer should be taken more seriously. It's a very plausible option. I It's not one that resonates with my experience, but philosophically, I don't think it's incoherent. And I think it's very coherent. So, but again, what is coherent in abstraction doesn't necessarily translate to reality. So, yeah, I experience reality as a beautiful, meaningful, good place. It is good that has been pierced by brokenness and evil. But if you believe reality is an inherently fallen, evil, dark place that has been pierced by a few rays of light, uh, I'm not sure how I'm going to convince you otherwise, except by loving you and showing you love, and hopefully that bringing more light and beauty and goodness into your world until you start to see the scales as the other way. But philosophically, I think those are kind of the inside out versions of each other. I think everything that can be said for one could be inverted to defend the other. And I'm not entirely sure how philosophically I would get around that. That's the experience where that enters in. So, yep.
Right. Okay. I like your attitude because that's really humble and you don't say atheism is for fools or something like that. That's really, yeah, open, I would say. So
Well, I mean,
nice. Yeah.
there's a lot of people I mean, I teach a class on the Holocaust. If you're gonna live through uh, the Holocaust, which is a lot of the stories I go through, it experientially, it's hard for me to argue with you. If you've gone through something like that, I don't think any philosophical argument will be convincing. And I might not agree with you, but are you rational to take the stance you've taken in light of these events? Yeah, maybe you are. Doesn't mean you're right, but reason, like in those contexts. Yeah, anyways, sorry. Yeah, it's not an easy problem. So there's
Yes,
no
I
easy
agree.
answers.
Okay. Third argument is the nomological problem. How you answer on that? And can you please explain what is it at start? And yeah.
I guess I've just never found that to be an inconsistency. I've always found that the laws, the nomos of the universe, I guess I've always found that God is the best explanation of why there are laws to begin with. I'm not a huge fan of a God of the gaps argument when it comes to, oh, the bacterial flagellum, God must have entered into the DNA code right at this point because this needs God right here. I'm not a huge fan of those types of God of God gaps answers. But when you're talking about the fundamental forces and laws of existence, those aren't gaps. Those are the foundations of reality hovering, suspended, and held up by nothing. Those aren't like, oh, there's a billion gaps in the fossil record and we're going to insert God into every single one. Those are the very foundations of reality itself, the types of things that you would expect God to have forged and to have made. And so that's where I think God can really come in. And that's one of the reasons I'm more convinced by, say, cosmological teleology than I am by biological teleology. Because the sort of the basic building blocks of reality, like gravity, protons, these types of things, are just so exactly what they need to be for life to later come about, right? And so on that level, the basic laws of nature, to me, really do point to a lawgiver. I think once you have those laws, people then want to have God interrupt them to bring about things. And this is interesting. There's two different design arguments, and they're kind of contradictory. One design argument is that um, nature can't, nature sucks and needs God to fix it to get things done, right? God has to constantly interrupt nature to bring about humans, to bring about, you know what I mean? Like nature can't do it on its own. It needs God. That's one type of teleological argument, right? But the opposite teleological argument says the exact opposite. Nature is so perfect that it can do all these things on its own without need of interruption, right? So they're saying the exact opposite things, and depending on who you're arguing with, someone might pivot back and forth between those two accounts without realizing it. And I think the sort of God of the gaps, God interrupts nature because it sucks and needs to be fixed, is more like the William Paley design argument. And it's the one that in many ways has been the most popular amongst intelligent design movements. And my brother-in-law, Seth Hart, who does he did his PhD on this, and he's my co-host at the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. He really emphasizes that actually the stronger teleological argument is the one that's more built into the very foundations of reality. And he actually uses this to look at evolution and to say, okay, people keep trying to say, where does God interrupt evolution to introduce complexity? Well, what if the very foundational laws of evolution itself were where the teleology exists? So it's not interrupting evolution, rather it's just evolution itself. So he's looking at that question. And I think that's a really interesting one. And I think it gets into this question of the laws of nature and that sort of thing. And whether God, in order to do miracles, has to interrupt those laws, I mean, laws are just what God generally does, whereas miracles are just what he sometimes does, right? And if God does something enough times, we start to define it as a law of nature. That was Hume's attempt to argue that miracles can't be believed in because by definition, as soon as we have enough evidence for them, they must have been repeated enough to have that evidence. And so therefore, it's now just a law of nature. And so by definition, you can never have a miracle. Hume used that to argue against miracles. I would use that to say, what are we talking about when we say God interrupts nature? That's just an arbitrary distinction that humans have drawn that I don't know means anything to God. So anyways, am I getting at some of this or am I missing what you were wanting?
Yeah, that's right in the center. So I need to ask you about evolution because you discussed about that a few videos. And what is your view? Do you find that theory as compelling beyond any reasonable doubt, or do you consider maybe other options? Or yeah, what's your thought about that?
Yeah. Uh, my thought is that evolution is scientifically the best option. I think it has the best evidence for it. Now, that said, I think you would have been an idiot to doubt Newtonian mechanics for the period from like 1700 to 1900. You would have been insane to question that. It's one of the most overtly indisputable, like to have questioned Newtonian mechanics during that period, you would have had to have been the biggest idiot in the world. It was one of the most fundamental assumed, like Lord Kelvin says, we've solved physics. There's nothing left to do now. But then Einstein comes along and overturns the most deeply held assumptions ever. So do I think evolution is the best explanation on the current scientific theory? Yeah. Do I think people are poking holes in it? Sure, but every theory has holes that are being poked in it everywhere. It doesn't mean that's wrong. It's part of the scientific method is that we're constantly being open to holes being poked, and then we figure out why they can be poked, and then we adjust the theory. Does that mean evolution will be the dominant thing a few hundred years from now? I have no idea. Based on, I think maybe, probably, but I don't know. So I can say it's scientifically the best answer, while also saying who freaking knows. Theologically speaking, scripturally speaking, before we do theologically, scripturally, I can see some tensions with evolution, but I can also see some harmonies there. I think scripturally, St. Augustine in, around 400 looked at, well, why did God do it over 7 days? Why didn't he just snap his fingers and do it all at once? Well, Augustine said, because this is a process. God is gradually doing it, not all at once, but over periods of time. There's a process here, a growth, an evolution, to import a term, um, that is being described in the text here, as opposed to an instantaneous creation. And perhaps they weren't literal days. And those, like, he's getting into those discussions uh, thousands of years before modern science and evolution. And he's one of the biggest theologians in the church of all history. So, like, that type of interpretation of scripture isn't just because we're giving into modern science. Those are questions that people have always been having about scripture. And I think if you want to make scripture consistent with evolution, there's some cool ways to do it. Um, but I can also see what creationists are saying. There's some ways I'm uncomfortable with that. But at the same time, evolution basically says that the inanimate dust of the earth eventually became living. And what does God do? He scoops up the dust of the earth and breathes into it the breath of life. And that's what humans are. So, can I find a way to make sense of scripture in light of evolution? Sure. I could do the same thing with creationism in light of evolution. Theologically, I think you can make a lot of sense of evolution as well. I'm not terribly comfortable with the idea that progress is built atop a billion corpses and that all these entities and species have to die in order to bring about progress. But at the same time, those entities would have died anyway. Does anything own to the species, or is it only owed to individuals? A species dying out in order for other species to come through. Has the species been wronged? I mean, the species isn't an entity, right? The individual entities always were going to have to die at some point. So, like, I don't know if one species going extinct to bring about another uh, is something that's necessarily inherently wrong. I don't know. You could debate this, and I could see it being something sort of like an argument that, well, God maybe doesn't create evolution, because Satan exists before Adam and Eve, right? There could be a cosmic fall before the human fall. So perhaps death is on a cosmic level before the garden, and perhaps Satan is the reason for all of these things dying. But what does God do? He weaves out of that chaos and death progress. He takes what Satan meant for evil and turns it for good, which you could say is what evolution is. The death of individuals that are less genetically adapted to their environment and their species is used by God to bring about humanity. And so, like Iluvatar, like Tolkien's God, who takes the disjointed thumps of Morgoth and integrates them into the song to make it even more beautiful. Perhaps that's what evolution is, weaving out of death and chaos something progressive and beautiful. So I don't know. You can theologically make sense of these things, but you can theologically make sense of anything if you let me talk about it long enough. So who knows?
Okay, just a quick question. Do you see that evolution maybe proves that we can evolve from a cell or something, so that this proves God in some way? Or would you say that evolution, if it's 100% true, that points to something miraculous, that points to God or design or something? Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard William Lane Craig say that the stages of evolution are each of the different stages were so unlikely that if they did happen, that it would literally be a miracle and thus evidence for the existence of God. I heard him say that in a debate, and the whole crowd started cheering. Um, and I think it's you could go either direction with that, and this comes back to the opposite teleological arguments. Do you say evolution can't make sense of this, therefore God has to interrupt it to insert design once in a while, and therefore God exists? Or do you say evolution was a finely honed process embedded in nature itself that doesn't need God to interrupt, but because it doesn't need interruption, it's a finely honed machine. And the question is, who honed the machine? Why is it so perfect on its own that it doesn't need interruption? And so you could go either direction with that. And depending on what cultural, scientific, philosophical framework and time you live in, we're going to go with one of those or the others. And most people won't even be aware of that back and forth. And we'll just kind of do both at the same time without being consistent. I don't know. I think either could be plausible.
All right, thank you. Fourth argument for atheism, the incoherence of divine attributes. So omniparadoxes, how God can be omnipotent, and yeah, there are many problems. Can you name some of these problems, paradoxes, and do you believe that it is argument against existence of such a being? You can start with
Well,
defining God. Do you believe is he omniscient or yeah?
so I believe God is omniscient, all knowing. I think, I mean, he's the logos. So I think all logical things, like he's gotta have those. Um, the question of whether God, when you start getting to the minutia, that's where I'm kind of like, I don't know. And an example of minutia would be, does God know what it's like to be Jonathan, JD Lyon, me, from my perspective? Well, God knows what it's like to be Jonathan from God's perspective, and he knows everything about me, but does he know what it's like to actually be me? Well, he can't be me, can he? Does he have that kind of, he has objective knowledge about everything that I am, but does he have subjective knowledge as if from my perspective? I don't know. I think the incarnation comes really close to that. And if God doesn't have some aspect of that kind of knowledge, I don't care. Like I get that some people think those are really difficult logical problems. And I can see that to some extent, but like every theory breaks down at those types of extremes. And so the fact that God might as well, I don't have a huge issue with. That I mean that's true across the board, not just in religion, but like every if you take something to its extreme, if you reduce it to absurdity, you get absurdity. And so those types of questions, I don't know. And the other question of how can God have knowledge of temporal states, for example? Uh, if God is timeless, how can he have knowledge of temporal states? Well, I mean, I actually think I don't want to say I've answered it, but I've given an answer that I'm satisfied with in my book, Monotheism, available on Amazon. Um, so you can check that out. But again, I think that that's one of those nitpicky problems that I don't know if anyone solves, and some people can obsess about. But I actually think the question of how can God be timeless and related to time, again, is one of those things that makes as much sense as our own existence. How can something, because if time creates itself, then you have an infinite regression of temporal causes, right? And that doesn't make sense. Okay, so there must be a timeless cause of time. Okay, but if it's timeless, how does it begin to create in time? Because to begin to do it is a temporal process, right? And so something that is in time can't explain something else that's in time infinitely, or else you end up with an infinite regression. But nor can you appeal to something that's timeless to begin to create in time. So what do you appeal to? I don't know. It doesn't make sense. And that's not just a problem for the Christian, it's a problem for anyone who believes the universe exists. So, can I make sense of how God's timelessness relates to time in terms of omniscience, in terms of creation? No, but neither can the atheist make sense of how the universe began to exist because they can't make sense of how time began either. So, it cannot be a factor in determining whether atheism or Christianity is true because both of us suck and don't have an answer to that problem. So,
Yeah, that's honest. Yeah, even Molinists or open theists would acknowledge that they have a theory, but that's not a solution, a final word about that. It still seems like a contradiction. Yeah.
yeah.
So, what about omnipotence? Because is it better to say that God is the most powerful being rather than all powerful? What do we say?
Yeah, so if they want to mean by all powerful that he can do things that are logically impossible, can God create a boulder that's so heavy for him to lift? I mean, this gets into whether contradictions are real or just seeming, right? Like with the question before. Um, I would say that I think God is something that at least seems impossible at times. Does that mean he is illogical? I don't know. But I'm comfortable with saying just because he seems illogical to my finite, flawed thinking, that he still can be real. Um, can God create a boulder that's so heavy for him to lift? I mean, again, this is one of those things that if you want to say God goes beyond logic, then maybe he could. I don't know if you have to say that. I don't think I've actually said that God goes beyond logic. I just say he seems to, which is an important distinction. But yeah, if you want to say not that God is all powerful, then I'm okay with that. I think the problem with saying God is the most powerful is that it almost makes God seem not like being itself, but rather as a being and just the highest being amongst beings, as if a few tiers down from him was Iron Man and the Hulk, and he's just a few steps higher than that. So I don't want to say he's the most powerful, as if there's a comparison there in a continuum, and he's just at the top of the continuum as most quantitatively that. No, he's not just quantitatively the most powerful. His power is qualitatively different. It's an infinite power in comparison to finite powers. Um, so in that sense, maybe not most powerful, but I, God has every power that it is possible to have to an infinite degree. What's the term for that? I don't know. So something like that.
All right, and last argument for atheism, um, the problem of conflicting supernatural worldviews with equal or greater explanatory power. Let's say we have Hinduism. How you rule out that religion because it has some sense, I believe. And what is your answer?
You mean Hinduism can provide explanatory power for lots of things? So if it can explain things as well, well, I guess you could go to simplicity. It's not just the ability to explain things, it's the ability to explain them simply with the least amount of ad hoc factors. Um, However, with something like Hinduism, you could say it's not simple to have millions of gods. But when you get deeper into Hinduism, you're realizing that, well, there's a lot more to do with Brahman and sort of an underlying oneness to this worldview. And its ability to incorporate all these different movements and beliefs in gods is really neat. But at the heart of it, there's a claim about oneness, which then manifests as threeness in the three, like Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahman. Like I think when it comes to Hinduism, I think Hinduism is probably, to me, the most plausible worldviews are either nihilism, Christianity, or Hinduism. Because I think uh, Christianity and Hinduism are both having that unity and diversity conversation about ontology and how does oneness relate to manyness. So I think in their ontologies, they're having similar conversations. And I lean towards like I'm a Christian, not a Hindu, but I find Hinduism to be very plausible in that way. Um, so like I could see that being a temptation. So can it explain? I don't know if it explains everything, but I do think it has a very elegant account for ontology. Um, and in some ways, the main Hindu Orthodox camps are situated around trying to answer that question in a way that Christians have never been nearly as ontological about, which I like. I like ontology. Um, this is not I'm answering, this is a much broader answer than what your question actually was. Um, but yeah, I think Hinduism is interesting. I don't know if it explains things better or simpler than, say, science would, but I think science also needs to be explained. And the possibility of seeing underlying unity and patterns in the diverse empirical facts of existence. I mean, even the claim of simplicity, Occam's razor, the idea that the more simpler things are, the truer they are. That assumes an ontology where at the heart of reality, things are simple and one. That's the sort of thing science doesn't get into. because science doesn't talk about ontology or metaphysics. So, uh, in terms of explaining finite facts, I don't know if Hinduism or Christianity are better than science or atheism. In terms of explaining the broader world and factors that are needed before you even get to doing science, I think you need something more theological and philosophical, even if it gets more complicated when you do bring that in. I don't know.
Okay, but if God exists, wouldn't we expect that there is one religion and one view about God because he reveals to some people rather than many religions and denominations and different views about God? So that's like argument against God's existence. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, so there's the moral aspect of that, and there's the epistemological knowledge aspect of that. I mean, for every correct theory, whether it's in mathematics or history or science, there's hundreds of incorrect theories. And so, factually speaking, you would expect there to be one, there could be one right religion and a bunch that are wrong. In terms of epistemologically, that should be expected. The question, though, that is making that difficult is the moral aspect. That if God is a moral and good God, wouldn't he make it clearer for us, right? Um, and I think that's really difficult. I think I don't think all religions are 100% wrong. I think they point towards the nature of being, beauty, truth, goodness, and the one who is being truth, beauty, and goodness itself. Um, but at the same time, I think that there's a crack, a chasm between us and the one who is being truth, goodness, and beauty itself, and that's sin. We're finite and we're fallen. And I think for me, the worldview that has actually done something about that and made sense of how we overcome it is Christianity, which makes that crack, that sinfulness, the heart of the story, and God taking that upon God's self in a way that I think is, if not unique, at least dissimilar to a lot of other religious views. Um, and so I think we can all point to the nature of God, but I think Christianity actually gives us a way back to God. I think a lot of the religions say true things about God, but don't overcome that chasm the way that Jesus does. Um, and I don't know why God hasn't done that in every culture in equivalent ways. Some people have said that he has. It depends on who you're talking to. There's some people who believe in anonymous Christians, that sort of idea that the sacrifice and forgiveness of Jesus has been made known to other cultures in other languages. I don't know what to say about that. Um, but also the fact that the church is part of the story. Uh, Jesus comes, but then the next 2,000 years are the church telling the world about Jesus. If the church isn't supposed to do that, if we're not to take that message that was given to a particular time and place and make it universal, then there's no role for the church in history, really. And so this is God inviting us into the story and allowing us to play a part in the story. Um, and I think that's interesting. I don't know. I don't think anyone has a totally perfect answer to this question. Um, and the easy way out is to just say, well, other religions aren't all going to hell automatically, and to start taking sort of an inclusivist view or even a universalist view. And I don't want to dismiss those entirely, but I also don't want to retreat there too quickly. It's a difficult question. So.
All right, and let's conclude our discussion. Can you just say what of these five arguments are good or what are bad? We have logical problem of Trinity, logical problem of evil, nomological problem, omniparadoxes, and other religions. So Can you say what are good of those arguments for atheism?
I think the other religions one's probably the best. And part of that's because it's empirical. Um, God could have created a world where Jesus's message was heard across the earth, or where he came down and yelled it at everyone. And everyone's like, oh, well, the gospel was literally written in fire in the clouds. Maybe we should believe that. Um, I can imagine a universe where this wouldn't be a problem, but that's not our universe. And so there's an empirical element to it. And this question of what Christianity is and means and will be in a globalizing world where it has to make sense of all these different worldviews, I don't think we have great answers to that yet. I think that's the gauntlet for the next 500 years. That's that's rethinking all of everything in light of this new era of history. It's as epochal as the encounter with Greek philosophy was in the early church. And I think it's going to lead to something as new, but hopefully as also true to the original Jesus as the merger of Greek philosophy and Christianity was. And something new, but also very old in new ways. So I don't know what the answer to the world religions question is, but I think that's what theology is supposed to attend to for, no one's going to answer this quickly. This is what the next 500 years are going to be, is what do we do in this emerging global world where everyone is interconnected and no one agrees on any of this stuff religiously. I think the other questions, almost all of them, I think come back to what I already said, uh, which is that all of these problems make as much sense as our own existence. Uh, which is, yeah, the Trinity has issues. Yeah, God's attributes of how he can be timeless, but also have temporal states and temporal indexically temporal knowledge. Those I can't make sense of those, but those are just repetitions of the same enigmas that even atheists have to deal with when they're talking about how the world got to be the way it is. And the Christian might not have a better answer to those questions, but ours isn't worse than anyone's. So why would you reject Christianity because our answers are as crappy as everyone else's? You got to find a different basis on which to decide which worldview is true or not, because everyone sucks when it comes down to those types of details.
All right, Dr. Lyonhart, can you just say something for the end for audience? What is final message? And you can promote again your book. So can you tell something at the end?
Me. That's the mess. No, no, I know. It's like the theologian's supposed to be talking about God, but he's making it about himself. I mean, what is more true to the spirit of church history and the ego of the theologian than talking about God, but really just making it about himself? No, thanks for having me on the show. This was fun. Sorry that I mean, that was a shotgun of different questions. So I kind of just stream of conscious spoke through all of them. I hope it wasn't too winding for you. But I'm glad to have been here with you guys. And if you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts on these things, yeah, you can check out the book, Monotheism. But you can also check out the podcast, Spiritually Incorrect Podcast, as well, where we deal with a lot of these issues, spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com. We just did an episode on C.S. Lewis a few weeks ago. We did an episode on what's worth fighting about. Should be churches be fighting about homosexuality, evolution, the Trinity, like what's essential for us to believe to be Christians and to agree, and what can we disagree about? Those are hard questions. And the next episode is about where was God in the Holocaust? So that's addressing the suffering question very heads on in a very tangible way. So yeah, if you're interested in those kind of topics, we cover that on the Spiritually Incorrect podcast as well. So
Okay, Dr. Lyonhart, thank you for being with us today. And we really enjoyed, and I learned much from you. And I hope that the audience also learned something from this discussion. And thank you for taking time to come to our podcast. And I hope that we will see you again.
thanks for having me.